My name is James, and the seas have been my home for more than 2.5 decades. As an experienced navigator, I know every corner of the world's most challenging oceans. But I never imagined that day in the Drake Passage would be any different from the countless other work days I had lived through. Aboard the fishing vessel, Neptune, our crew was excited. After weeks of hard work, we were about to return home. The morning began like any other expedition. The Antarctic sky was exceptionally clear, a rare sight in those frozen waters. A few snowflakes danced gently in the air. The thermometer read 15 degrees below zero, a temperature considered mild for that extreme region, where the wind cuts through the skin and the cold seeps into the bones. Our vessel sliced through the dark waters with the familiarity of those who knew every movement, every vibration of the hull. We were 15 experienced men, each with a specific role, a cog in the complex mechanism of survival at sea. Rodriguez was in charge of the nets, Tommy was our youngest lookout, and Phil took care of the engines. Everyone united by the same goal, bringing in our catch and returning home. The nets were full, which only added to the crew's enthusiasm. We mainly fished for krill and Antarctic fish, a tough job requiring both physical and mental endurance. Each trip was a battle against the elements, and at that moment, we were close to victory, our holds filled with fish. Looking at my companions, I saw faces marked by the sun, the wind, and the salt. Men who knew the sea not as something beautiful or romantic, but as a brutal and unpredictable workplace. Each of them had stories to tell, scars to show, and memories of past expeditions etched into their expressions. Tommy, our young lookout, represented the new generation of sailors. With his keen eyes and the curiosity characteristic of youth, he was always alert to any unusual movement in the waters. His muscles had yet to develop the toughness of the veterans, but his dedication was unquestionable. He observed everything with a mix of respect and fascination for the ocean. That particular morning, something felt different. It wasn't a bad premonition, just a subtle sensation that something was about to happen. The sea, usually filled with the sounds of waves and marine animals, held an unusual stillness. The waters seemed darker, denser, as if they were hiding a deep secret. The routine of a fishing expedition consists of moments of intense labor interspersed with long periods of waiting. That day, everyone was relaxed, some sleeping in their bunks, others preparing equipment, chatting about their plans after returning home. There was a feeling of an almost completed mission, of an impending victory. My 25 years of experience at sea had taught me to respect every nuance, every subtle change in the environment. I knew the ocean wasn't just water, it was a living being, complex and unpredictable. I had seen storms appear out of nowhere. Icebergs drift silently, currents shift their courses without warning. The sea always holds surprises for those who dare to challenge it. At that moment, I had no idea that this journey would forever change my relationship with the ocean. I didn't know that in just a few hours, my life would be completely transformed, that I would lose dear crewmates and have my perception of the marine world entirely altered. To me, at that instant, it was just another workday in the Drake Passage, another journey that would soon become one of many in my long career as a navigator. It was Tommy who first noticed something strange. The young man, with his still untrained eyes not yet fully accustomed to the sea's subtle signs, sensed a silence that shouldn't have existed. The seals that usually crowded the nearby icebergs had completely vanished. It was as if all marine life had evaporated in the blink of an eye. Knowing my experience, Tommy hesitated before approaching me. "Captain," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "something isn't right." I stopped what I was doing and carefully scanned the horizon. Silence at sea is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of danger. The icebergs floated motionless, without the usual movement of seals and small seabirds. There was no sound of water being disturbed, no noise of breathing animals. An absolute emptiness stretched around us, breaking the noisy routine of our previous expeditions. Rodriguez, my first mate for years, noticed my worried expression. "What do you think, Captain?" he asked in a low voice, as if speaking too loudly might shatter that eerie equilibrium. I shook my head, unable to rationally explain what I was feeling. It wasn't fear, but an ancient survival instinct telling me to stay alert. At sea, I learned that there are invisible signs, languages that only those who live intimately with the waters can understand. That silence was more than just an absence of sound. It was a warning, a message passed down through generations of sailors, telling us that something different was about to happen. Years of experience had taught me never to ignore these signs. Every movement, every absence, every nuance of the ocean could mean the difference between life and death. And at that moment, something told me we were about to face something entirely out of the ordinary. My hand instinctively tightened around the ship's wheel, my eyes scanning every inch of the horizon. The stillness was unsettling. It felt as if all marine life had been pulled into some unknown place, leaving behind only an absolute void. Tommy remained by my side, his body tense, his eyes wide with a mix of anticipation and fear. Young as he was, he didn't yet fully understand the silent language of the sea, but he was learning, and at that moment, his youthful instinct aligned perfectly with my experience. Something was about to happen, and then, as if the sea itself were preparing a stage for what was to come, the silence began to change. Not into noise, not into movement, but into a presence. A sensation that something massive, something ancient was about to rise from its depths. None of us could have imagined the terror that awaited us. The first sign came as an almost imperceptible tremor. Rodriguez shouted from the deck, "Captain, there's something strange in the water." I ran to the edge of the ship, and my blood literally froze. A massive shadow, larger than anything I had seen in decades of navigation, was moving beneath our boat. At first, I thought it was a blue whale. I had seen those giant creatures before. But the shape was different, more angular, more menacing. The shadow moved with a precision that wasn't natural, an intelligence that went beyond common animal behavior. Then it emerged. An orca, but not just any orca. This creature was easily 3 times larger than normal, its black dorsal fins slicing through the water like a sharp blade. The size was impressive, but it wasn't just that which made me step back. It was the eyes. God, those eyes. They weren't the intelligent, curious eyes we knew from regular orcas. They were ancient, predatory eyes, filled with a malignant intelligence that made me tremble to my very soul. There was something in that gaze that challenged everything I understood about marine life. Depths that went beyond animal instinct, something that seemed to carry memories of forgotten eras. The creature watched us with incredible precision. It wasn't an animal hunting. It was something studying us, measuring us, as if we were being evaluated by a higher intelligence. Tommy was frozen at my side, his breath caught in a mixture of terror and fascination. The orca was a monster of proportions that defied reality. Its black skin gleamed under the Arctic sun, immense muscles moving with deadly grace. Every movement was calculated. Each second of its exposure seemed like a deliberate challenge, as if it were provoking us, daring us to understand its existence. I vaguely recalled ancient stories from fishermen, whispers about sea creatures beyond human comprehension, legends of monsters sleeping in the frozen depths. I had always considered them just stories, tales meant to scare young sailors. Now, facing that creature, I began to question everything I knew about the natural world. The orca remained there, its presence completely dominating our field of vision. It was as if the entire ocean had transformed into that one creature, into that one gaze that pierced us, that went beyond flesh and bone, as if it were searching our very souls. Rodriguez murmured something in Spanish, a prayer, perhaps a plea for protection. Tommy was completely still, struggling to process what he was seeing, and I, with all my experience, all my life at sea, felt that we were about to enter a confrontation that would challenge every limit of survival. That thing should have stayed in the forgotten depths of the ocean, and now, it was right in front of us, challenging us, about to reveal a terror none of us could have imagined. "Everyone inside, now!" I had barely finished shouting when the first impact hit the hull. The entire ship shook as if we had collided with an iceberg. But it wasn't just one, it was several. 5, Maybe 6 monstrous orcas circled our vessel like sharks preparing for an attack. The sound of metal twisting mixed with the desperate screams of the crew. Each impact was calculated, precise, as if those creatures had a strategic intelligence beyond any animal behavior I had ever witnessed. It wasn't a random attack, it was a meticulously planned hunt. The second impact was devastating. One of the creatures struck the hull from below with such force that it threw 3 men into the sea. Their screams. I still hear those screams every night in my nightmares. They were swallowed by the black water in seconds, and the sea turned red. I tried to reach the radio, shouting our coordinates, begging for help. But the orcas seemed to anticipate every move we made. One of them, the one I mentally called Leviathan, partially leaped out of the water, its massive jaw biting into the side of the ship as if it were paper. Its teeth, each the size of my forearm, pierced the metal like butter. Rodriguez was shouting, trying to organize something that was already pure chaos. Tommy, the young lookout, was frozen in terror, his wide eyes witnessing total destruction. The lifeboats were the first targets of the creatures. They knew exactly what they were doing. The deck turned into a nightmare of ropes, nets, and blood. So much blood. Men I had known for years were thrown around like rag dolls, their lives slipping away in seconds. Each impact cracked the ship more, and each charge of the orcas brought us closer to death. The destruction was so fast that we barely had time to react. It was as if those creatures had studied every inch of our vessel, knew every weak spot, every location where a blow would be most devastating. They weren't wild animals. They were predators with an intelligence far beyond the hunting instinct. Another impact, and another. The Neptune, my precious ship that had been with me for so many years, began to break apart as if it were made of paper. The orcas circled, their movements synchronized, as if they were part of a deadly orchestra, each one knowing exactly its role in that dance of destruction. The temperature of panic is colder than any Antarctic water. I watched my companions being ripped away. I heard the screams blending with the sound of metal breaking apart. And amidst that chaos, one certainty consumed me. This was not a natural attack. This was something much, much worse. The few survivors clung to floating debris, struggling against the extreme cold that seemed to want to consume us faster than the orcas themselves. The water was so cold it felt like it was burning. Each breath was agony, the Arctic air slicing through our lungs like ice blades. Mike, my first mate for 10 years, managed to fire a flare before being swallowed by a giant wave. Rodriguez and young Tommy managed to cling to a floating piece of the deck with me. Phil, our chief engineer, swam desperately toward us, his weak movements signaling the onset of hypothermia. We held onto each other, trembling uncontrollably, forming a small survival group amidst the liquid chaos. The orcas continued to circle, as if playing with us. Sometimes one would pass so close that we could feel its massive body brushing beneath our feet. Young Tommy began to cry, his tears freezing instantly on his face. His crying was a desperate sound, a mix of fear and complete helplessness. Rodriguez murmured prayers in Spanish, his lips nearly blue from the intense cold. "Stay together!" I shouted through my chattering teeth. "Don't move too much! Conserve energy!" My voice was a command born from years of survival experience at sea, but I knew our chances were slim. Hypothermia was our most relentless enemy at that moment. The portable radio on my life jacket still worked, a miracle amidst the carnage. I kept transmitting our position, praying someone would hear us. The minutes dragged on like hours. The cold was so intense we could no longer feel our limbs, our perception reduced to that primal struggle for survival. The orcas seemed to be playing with us. One of them, especially cruel, would partially emerge, staring directly at us with those evil eyes. There was something there, a dark, ancient intelligence that shouldn't exist in this world. They weren't just animals hunting for food, they were creatures that seemed to delight in our suffering. Phil was the first to succumb to hypothermia. His eyes slowly lost focus, his skin turning blue. "I'm sorry, Captain," were his last words before he slipped under the water. We didn't have the strength to hold on to him. We looked at the wreckage of the Neptune, our ship reduced to pieces scattered across the ocean. Years of work, memories, stories. Everything destroyed in minutes by those creatures that defied any natural understanding. Rodriguez squeezed my hand, a silent gesture of solidarity and desperation. With each passing moment, our chances of survival dwindled. The cold took over our bodies, our energy draining away like the hope for rescue. And yet, we continued to cling to each other, witnesses to a nightmare no one would ever believe. Soon after, Rodriguez noticed that young Tommy was beginning to show the first signs of severe hypothermia. His movements slowed down, his skin taking on a worrying bluish tint. His lips trembled uncontrollably, and his gaze started to lose focus, drifting across the horizon as if he wasn't fully present anymore. One by one, my men were succumbing. Mike had been swallowed by a giant wave in the early moments of the attack. His desperate screams still echoed in my mind, a lament that cut deeper than the Arctic wind. The bodies were disappearing into the dark waters, as if the ocean was reclaiming them one by one. Each loss was a blow to my soul as a captain. Men I had known for years, with whom I shared stories, laughter, and moments of anguish, now became just another frozen memory in the Drake Passage. I mentally counted. 3 men lost in the first impact, Mike swallowed by the wave, Phil sinking into the icy seas, and so many others whose faces now stared at me in fragmented memories. 11. 11 good men who had lost their lives that day to something that shouldn't even exist. Rodriguez, with his last strength, looked at me. His eyes conveyed a mix of fear, resignation, and deep sadness. We were the only ones still clinging to the wreckage, witnesses to a tragedy that defied any rational understanding. Tommy, the young observer, was growing closer to the edge. The orcas continued their macabre dance around the wreckage, as if celebrating their victory over our crew. Their dorsal fins sliced through the water, constant reminders of our utter helplessness in the face of those monstrous creatures. I thought about the families, the mothers waiting for their children in distant ports, the wives preparing dinners for husbands who would never return, the children who would grow up without knowing their fathers. Each lost man represented a story interrupted, a future stolen by those incomprehensible creatures. The loss was not just ours. It was a loss that would affect entire fishing communities. 11 life stories reduced to cold reports of disappearances at sea. 11 families who would have to learn to live with the absence, with the uncertainty, with the pain of never having a body to bury. And there, floating in those deadly waters, we were just survivors, witnesses to a terror that few would understand, carrying the weight of all those lost lives in a single, terrible day. The sound of the helicopter's rotors was the sweetest thing I had ever heard in my entire life as a sailor. A melody of hope amidst absolute chaos, a call for salvation that cut through the deathly silence that enveloped us. When the rescue cable dropped, I felt an energy renew my nearly frozen muscles. "Now! Swim!" I shouted with all the strength I had left. Tommy was the first, grabbing the rope with a desperation that mixed fear and hope. Rodriguez helped him, ensuring the boy got on safely. Every movement was a battle against the cold, the exhaustion, and the orcas that continued to circle our wreckage. I knew those creatures wouldn't give up easily. While the cable swung in the air, they intensified their attacks, trying to bring down our last hope of salvation. The Leviathan, that giant orca that seemed to be the leader of the inexplicable attack, made one last dramatic attempt. It leaped out of the water, its massive jaws wide open, coming so close I could feel its foul breath. By mere inches, literally inches, we escaped its deadly teeth. When I finally got into the helicopter, my body barely responded. Rodriguez pulled me inside, our frozen clothes cracking with every movement. The paramedics wrapped us in thermal blankets, starting emergency procedures to combat hypothermia. Tommy was in shock. His empty eyes stared into the void, mechanically repeating disconnected words. Rodriguez prayed in Spanish, his trembling hands holding an old rosary he always carried around his neck. I simply watched. Below us, the orcas still circled the wreckage of the Neptune. Their black dorsal fins cut through the water like sails of death, a constant reminder of the terror we had faced. Every movement of those creatures seemed to challenge us, as if our escape was just a temporary detail in their plans. The pilots and rescue crew looked at us with a mix of horror and disbelief. Our stories seemed more like a delirium from men on the brink of death than a real account. How could they believe that orcas with such characteristics existed? How could they understand what we had lived through? As they took us away from those deadly waters, one certainty consumed me. Nothing would ever be the same. That experience had marked my soul forever. The sea, which had always been my home, was now a nightmare territory, a place where creatures beyond human comprehension could awaken at any moment. I retired from navigation right after that day, but the sea never truly left me. My new mission became understanding those creatures that defied all natural logic. I spent years diving into old archives, talking to elderly fishermen, collecting fragmented reports about giant orcas that slept in the depths of the Antarctic ice. I discovered ancient stories, legends from indigenous peoples who spoke of ancestral sea creatures, beings that were neither entirely animals nor fully intelligent. Ancient records suggested that global warming was waking something that should have remained dormant in the frozen depths. My obsession led me to find other survivors of similar attacks, scattered reports of expeditions that had been attacked by orcas with absolutely impossible behaviors. Each story was a fragment of a puzzle I needed to piece together, each testimony a piece that could explain that terror. Tommy, the young observer, never fully recovered. Years later, I found him working as an oceanography technician, his eyes always turned to the sea with a mix of fear and fascination. Rodriguez left navigation and became a priest, dedicating his life to praying for souls lost in deep waters. But the true discovery came from an ancient manuscript found in a research archive in Patagonia. A document written by a 19th century explorer who described sea creatures with superior intelligence, the result of genetic mutations caused by natural radioactive underwater currents. Something that modern science would consider impossible, but that made perfect sense to me. On stormy nights, I still wake up sweating, reliving those moments of terror. My nightmares are filled with ancient eyes staring at me from the depths, reminding me that there are things in the ocean that defy our understanding. Things that should remain in the depths, sleeping their eternal sleep in the ice. And sometimes when I look at the horizon, I'm sure they're still out there, calculating their next move, because the sea holds secrets that no human being will ever fully understand. What we experienced that day in the Drake Passage wasn't just an attack. It was a warning that there are worlds beyond our comprehension, intelligences that don't follow our rules, creatures that can sleep for centuries and wake up when we least expect it. And when they wake up, no one will be prepared.